Well, we had quite a collection of questions this evening, and as the title might imply, they get rather complicated. Now, as I've explained before, we do not want to enter into any theological controversies. So we will try to answer these questions simply as we feel may be useful and the best of our abilities, but we have no dogmatic factor to consider. We're not going into any dogmatic positions. Here's one. If individuals may be relieved of the consequence of their sins and actions by the sacrifice of another, as so many believe, where is reason for a belief in justice? Of course, this is a point I've been sort of pounding on for a good many years myself. The belief that an individual can be saved by another person. There are points of interest, I think, however, in most of the doctrines which involve this concept. Namely, that salvation of this nature must be also accompanied by a sincere or earnest desire on the part of the person who is in error to mend his own ways. That this salvation by messianic dispensation is involved also in moral conduct. Many of the groups affirming such a belief also point out that the messianic teacher brings with him a way of salvation, a doctrine or code or creed through the practice of which the individual may attain to a certain state of grace. It is perfectly true that many of these beliefs have been highly dogmatized, but as we look through the original sacred writings or the teachings given by these spiritual leaders, we see a certain reasonableness in most cases. And I think that it is interpretation, perhaps, which has largely created what to the rationalist appears to be an unreasonable situation. If nature can be defeated, if one individual can actually forgive the sin of another, then obviously we do not have any justice. Yet we also have in the courts of law the right to pardon by extraordinary circumstance. And if there be any question or doubt as to the justice of a sentence, or if the court feels that the penalty is excessive or beyond reason, pardon is frequently the privilege of the court or of the governor or of the country. Therefore, an individual sincerely repentant may be relieved of those parts of his sentence which no longer seem to have meaning or to attain any desirable end. This, however, is not regarded as a violation of justice. It is an effort to achieve to a higher justice, a justice in equity rather than a justice in law. And I presume we might assume that the same could happen. Extenuating circumstances exist within the consciousness of peoples. It is very hard to establish a fixed rule and say that this person is bad and deserves only perdition, and this individual is very good and deserves only salvation. These may be man's interpretations, but they are highly biased. And as we cannot fully understand the inner workings of ourselves or anyone else, there is a possibility that our concept of justice may not be in all cases just. I think that there is a legal ground for the belief or for the practice that a person who has obviously mended his ways, who has achieved within himself certain accomplishments which might theoretically compensate for punishment, so that the crime no longer exists in the person, that it might be possible for the court or for some other interested person to alleviate that sentence by discretion. I think this may be what is implied also in the religious sense, that we are not sure enough of these things. I'm reminded of a story about the time when Queen Victoria, then a young girl, having just come to the throne, was presented with the problem of signing her first death warrant. When this was presented to the Queen by one of the high secretaries, she was obviously tremendously emotionally disturbed. And she turned to the Chamberlain and she said, "Is this man really so bad?" And the officer said, "Well, madam, he is an army deserter. He has deserted 3 times and has had leniency. And now, according to the laws of the army, his offense is capital. There seems to be no extenuating circumstances. He didn't go to see a dying mother or anything of that kind. He just walked out." The Queen said, "But can't you find anything, isn't there anything in him at all that's good?" The Chamberlain smiled and said, "Well, he's quite popular. He has a very nice smile." The Queen said, "That's enough, pardoned." So you find that human nature works in these problems. And I suppose in our own thoughts, God becomes very much like parent. We expect to be forgiven. We expect to be understood beyond reason. These beliefs have been part of faith for so long that I don't know that we have any way of clarifying them. But I think the average thoughtful person today isn't really so much interested in this phase of it. It would be hard to imagine that civilization would go on forever with man's only hope of salvation being that he is forgiven of all of his ills. We would affirm or assume that in the course of time he would have a tendency to outgrow some of these things, and that in time his sense of honor would cause him to desire to be right rather than to be forgiven for being wrong. And that is the motion which I think philosophical religions have largely sustained. As I say, I do not want to enter into a religious controversy on this problem. But in family, in home, in country, in community, we see these forces operating, and we are forced to assume that they are a genuine example of man's own internal psychological interpretation of life. Now let's see what we have here. Is not everything existing on the physical plane an exteriorization of a thought, which must be adjusted through the one who issued the thought, in accordance with his responsibility and at the conjunction of time, condition, and place? In other words, nothing is by accident. Well, this is also a problem which is going to be very disillusioning to many people, because most folks live in a world of accidents. These accidents are not only the causes of concern and difficulties, but they are our principal hope in time of trouble. We hope that something good will happen to us, and as we doubt that we deserve it, it would almost have to be accidental. And we actually live in the continuous optimistic expectancy of constructive accidents. And this is a part of our way of life. We sort of believe in luck. And we do not agree usually with Goethe that luck is entirely linked to merit. But actually, I would say that essentially an accident does not occur. There are situations arise in nature which appear so totally accidental that it would require a very deep philosophy to rationalize these things into an intent. Take, for example, the recent earthquakes in Chile. It seems impossible to rationalize these as part of a program of any kind. Yet an accident implies an unreasonable or irrational situation, and our knowledge must finally extend to the point to realize that the earthquake is a natural effect of causes which must be antecedent, that the earthquake doesn't just happen. It is the result of the outworkings of universal laws in some form or in some way. Accidents, therefore, are effects, and they are very often negative miracles. A miracle is something wonderful which we cannot explain. An accident is something terrible which we cannot explain. But both have to have their foundations in law, in fact, and in reality. The only trouble is there is so much of law, so much of fact, and so much of reality that we do not understand. And whenever we are in the presence of either an accident or a miracle, it should certainly give us cause for humility, for the recognition of our own ineptitudes, our inability to know all that there is to know about even the smaller things of life around us. I think, however, that at the root of our existence, there must be a faith or a belief that things are not the consequences of blind, accidental circumstances. One of the ways in which we can test a doctrine is by its utility. Sometimes we have no other proof of knowledge except the consequences of the things we know and the things we do. And those attitudes which by their consequences are not generally beneficial may be questioned or may be regarded as unsuitable for general belief. I think that we have proven by materialism that a universe of accidents, a universe without a controlling, adequate, rational principle, the belief in such a blind universe is detrimental to the individual, destructive to society, and suitable to reduce nearly all of the desired cultural achievements of man. These things are contrary to the kinds of attitudes which help people to grow. And there must be some question in nature as to whether that is real which does not help. And I would be inclined to place utility as one of the available criteria of knowledge, and to assume that that which makes a person less capable of living well, having in this sense no utility, can scarcely be regarded as a desirable doctrine. Whereas justice, or the principles of law and order, applied to nature and the universe, these concepts give the individual confidence. They also give him noble example. They give him courage to try to live well, in order that he may enjoy that adjustment with life which comes from living well. And those who have lived well have enjoyed this adjustment, and have found that although their physical fortunes may remain uncertain, that through right conviction they have elevated themselves above the common terrors of their kind, and have a security and an internal strength suitable to their needs. Doctrines of a negative nature reduce strength. Doctrines of a positive nature increase strength. And our belief that this universe is the product of a sovereign intellect, ruled by laws, and that it is a purposed creation, this type of believing does something for us, whereas reversed or negative believing does nothing for us, but many things to us that are not good. Therefore, by utility alone, I think positive doctrines are shown to be valid in the psychological and actual cultural life of the human being. Let's see what we have. That's the same one. Here's a little number on yellow paper. How is it possible to achieve a desireless state, when basically it is a desire to aspire to such perfection? Well, that's a nice, naughty little problem. That was one the Buddha worked on a long time. In fact, there are whole sections of the Buddhist canon devoted to this little gem of logic. Actually, Buddha says that desirelessness is a state to be desired, and that the last desire that man should overcome is the desire for truth, that he should desire that to the end, and that only ceases when his very capacity to desire is absorbed into the universal itself. Therefore, one of the noble truths of Buddhism is right desire, right dedication. And there is a certain difference. Perhaps two entirely different concepts are implied, but bound together by the futility of language. We know in the dictionary that under normal conditions, the term desire expresses what we want. And desire generally implies very physical, very reasonable, and very immediate things. The average person desires to be happy far more frequently than he desires to be wise. The individual desires to be prominent in his world far more than he desires to be more virtuous than other men. Now, it's quite possible that these two types of desire have a different category, that one type of desiring belongs to ambition, which is the impulse to possess or to exceed others in some respect, and the other belong in the category of aspiration, the longing to become or to share in those eternal realities which are not measured in terms of physical advantage or in the increase of domain or property or anything of that nature. To aspire to truth, to aspire to be better, perhaps is a better term than to say to desire to be better. Aspiration is a state of becoming, and without the quiet, devout instinct to become better, I imagine that growth would be far less rapid or less meaningful than it is to the more thoughtful persons. On the other hand, desirelessness, representing merely the dying out of the three fires of selfishness, the overcoming of those desires which are rooted in selfishness, or perhaps the aspiration to be able to say, not my will, but thine be done, referring to the will of God. That it might be conceivable that our desire that God's will may be done is different from any desire about ourselves. And in actually attempting to visualize this determination, actually we are continually subtracting or deducting from our own desire. The desire that truth shall be victorious is actually a statement of the renunciation of our personal desire. So I think that perhaps the difference lies in impersonal and personal desire, selfish or unselfish desiring. Buddha taught that in the end, all desiring ceases, inasmuch as man, attaining re-identification with total being, is like that total being without desire, because that being can lack nothing or be deficient in nothing, nor can it require the participation of anything other than itself. It cannot desire truth because it is truth. It cannot desire reality because it is reality. And it cannot desire unreality because it is real. Thus desire ends in the total experience of the divine nature. But perhaps if we realize that this term is a little tricky in the concept that it is one thing for us to desire that which we want, and it is rather different and a very great step to desire only that which God wants. This difference, probably, is the root of the problem in definition, and should be differentiated, and was differentiated in ancient languages and philosophies. But we use many words today in both a sacred and profane meaning, having no sacerdotal language, as our ancient forefathers did, by which they reserved great matters to a different idiom from what they used in trading and commerce. But as we must bring all these things into one idiom, it is more difficult, but I suspect wiser in the end, because the one idiom recommends to us the thought that sacred and profane things are of one essential nature, and we may as well face that fact and try to clarify the divine in all things which might otherwise seem physical or profane. It's a matter of words, and those who stumble over words will never attain to the crest of meaning, so that our inner meditation, I think, will straighten out a confusion of this kind. It's all possible. It's all possible. Is it possible, when helping others to rid themselves of psychic toxin, due to being sensitive ourselves, it can result in very unpleasant experiences, such as headaches, exhaustion, and sometimes physical illness? Oh, there's no doubt in the world that, as they used to say around the 20s when metaphysics was at its height, you can take on conditions. And among the conditions you can take on will be other persons' problems. You're sitting quietly in a bus and someone comes in with an exceedingly long face. Everyone in the bus has a relapse. We take on conditions inevitably. And in the presence of disturbing or negative situations, we do not feel as well as we would in the presence of more cheerful situations. Actually working closely with persons who are under unusual stress or strain, or who radiate stress and strain, it is quite possible to become fatigued. It is possible to develop sympathetic symptoms. It is possible for a highly imaginative person to sometimes feel that he has actually taken the ailment which he is nursing. Doctors and nurses frequently pass through this experience, and of course it is comparatively common in psychology. And after a psychological counselor has listened to the miseries of mankind long enough, he either has to take a long vacation or go on to therapy himself. You cannot completely resist the psychological consequence of the continuous pressure of negation upon your own psyche. It can theoretically be achieved, but it is very difficult to achieve. And where it is achieved, we find the person attaining to this generally obnoxious, because they are an unsympathetic, hard-hearted, cruel, indifferent person with every characteristic that we do not like. Most of all, they do not sympathize with us, which is a basic fault as far as we are concerned. Yet it is only the person who is insensitive, who simply doesn't feel much and cares less, who actually is defended against the consequences of sympathy. In medicine, for example, it is very rare, except in an emergency, for a physician to perform major surgery on a member of his own family. Even though he may be more experienced practitioner, he knows that the psychological stress may cause him to be nervous and might possibly cause him to fail in his operation, simply because he has too many sympathetic accords with the sufferer. Thus, any close psychological contact over a period of time makes it difficult for us to resist the tendency to take on sympathetic relationships. Now, there are certain things we can do about this. I don't know that there is a very definite panacea that has ever been developed. But psychological conditions from people are like all other psychological conditions. They are worse when we have no counteractive within our own natures. A person, for instance, who is caring for a sick individual, who leaves that sick person, perhaps when the day's or evening or night's shift is finished, whatever the nursing assignment may be, if that person goes home to a happy, congenial, important home life, then other interests begin to take over very quickly, and there are certain compensations. But if this nurse goes home to an empty room, or lives alone, has no family of her own, or has very few interests, she has very little with which to throw off the negative pressure to which she is constantly subjected. Therefore, any person under pressure from the sick, or from the ailing, or from the temperamentally difficult, must have an important life of their own to help compensate for whatever time they must spend ministering to the underprivileged or the unfortunate. Also, attitude has a great deal to do with these things. A strong faith helps us. A strong realization of the relationship of the circumstances to a larger truth. If, for instance, in working with a person who is miserable, we have very little inner enlightenment with which to orient ourselves, we can take on too much of the idea that this other person is being unjustly used. We can exaggerate their condition. We can find reason to feel that they are ill-treated. We lose orientation and become dissolved in sympathy, which opens up a very negative side of our nature. To be kind, to be helpful, and at the same time to be strong, will to a measure assist to keep a balance in these particular respects. If we have a feeling that an individual is either drawing heavily upon our energy reserves or is communicating to us too much from their energy fields, the ancients always advised, and their old medicine priests and everyone else did the same thing, that before and after all contact with the sick or the ailing, the individual should bathe as a means of grounding static electricity, which water does. Therefore, if you feel that you have been too closely associated with a sick person, take yourself a shower and finish off with cold water. This will have a tendency to drain off static electricity. It will also have a tendency to break any psychic tension patterns which might be developing. Also, during periods of this kind, try to have as much outside interest as possible. And something that very often helps is to try to influence the person with whom you are working to enlarge their own interests, to become more positive themselves, and your leadership in this direction will not only help them but often protect you. So try never to be catering to the weakness of others, even if they be weak and even though they be in a helpless situation and perhaps even not long for this life. Try to keep everything as far as possible on a positive level in your relationship with them. I've worked with a great many persons who were in desperate condition, and it is possible to move these people, in most cases, to a positive relationship with the facts of their own problem. The individual can even be brought into a positive relationship with the fact that he probably won't be here the next morning. It can be a positive relationship rather than a negative relationship. A relationship in which we think of value rather than forever being sorry, forever being sad, forever being negative. It is not generally sympathy of the maudlin kind that these people either want or need. It is strength. And if we are giving of strength, we are not accepting their weakness at the same time. If we are giving, we are defended by the outmotion of our own energy. If we give too much, we can get in trouble. But at the same time, it is better for us to be positive in relation to them than to be negative with them and allow their troubles to flow into us. Nearly all practitioners in various fields realize this to be a basic truth, and they try to work with it. Are there disciplines one can use in order to perfect oneself in seeing the human aura? Well, there are disciplines, but here again, extrasensory perception gamut has never been standardized. And even the researchers at Duke's and others who have attempted such research, this has never demonstrated that a person not sensitive in these matters, or deficient in the ability to use the extrasensory gamut, can suddenly become able to do so. There are mechanical aids to extrasensory perception, particularly the Kilner screens, and we have Dr. Kilner's book in the library if anyone wants to study it. This has to do with the use of a photographic dye to create a screen. If the sun is looked at through this screen, it affects the focus of the eye, and the person may then, for a time, have temporary ability to see the magnetic field of another person's body. Such experiments have been recorded. They've been written up in a number, not only of pseudo-scientific journals, but actually scientific journals. Actually, however, usually the degree of natural sensitivity is determined by evolutionary equations. Some persons are born with this ability. Some persons seem to develop it. A few cases it appears to be thrust upon them, but usually this can be traced to some legitimate series of circumstances. In the Oriental philosophies, certainly, it is assumed that the training systems of yoga and Vedanta might give this extrasensory range. It is doubtful, however, if in the West these techniques have been especially helpful, and the hazards involved are greater than the probable returns. It is very difficult for the individual to sensitize some area of his nature without finding himself unable to cope with some phase of the consequences. Man is strangely protected by certain insulation. He is given to labor only with what he is able to use. There is a balance between his capacity to perform certain functions and what is demanded of him by nature. If he unbalances this relationship, if he develops faculties by forcing growth, this forced development usually opens him to a series of consequent emergencies. He has not only the ability to see a little more than he did before, but he is able perhaps to see things which he cannot understand, and which he is almost certainly going to desperately misunderstand. And because his orientation is not equal to his new visualizing power, he may be in trouble. It's just another phase of this problem that we have in society today, in which our scientists have grown more rapidly than our philosophers and mystics, and have given us inventions far in excess of our moral power to use wisely. Any advancement of some special faculty within our own compound may be likened to this scientific advancement, which corresponds to one faculty of our social rationality. And this one special development, which seems to be in itself extraordinary and remarkable, and for which we would like to take a lot of credit, this development suddenly throws our entire society out of kilter, because we are not able to administer it, whereas nature, in its quiet, gradual way, builds us toward these ends and provides us with the means of using them. And if we are unable to use them through natural ignorance, the faculties generally disappear or are in various ways adapted to other faculties. Most persons have had psychic experiences. A great majority of persons, not being interested in the subject of psychism, do not even know they've had the experience. They simply assume that it was some one of a dozen perfectly natural situations. So they are untouched. Whereas another person passing through the same experience, deciding it to be highly psychical, and being of rather unsound and insecure emotional structure, may almost immediately become involved in a dangerous form of psychism. Nothing more happened to this person than to another who was unaffected, but his own attitude, his own temperament was different, and led him into trouble. And most persons who would like to develop extrasensory perceptions are not really quite ready for them. If they were ready for them, they'd be there and would not require development, because they do represent part of a natural raising of the total being. And when the consciousness, the understanding, the moral structure, the body vibratory rate, and all of these things are right, these experiences occur as part of our normal growth. Until they occur in this way, there's a good deal to be said about not forcing them. And I have seen many instances of this effort to force down through nearly 40 years, and I have records of some terrible tragedies resulting from perfectly sincere efforts to do these things, but being ill-equipped for the actual task of doing them. Now, I don't like to discourage folks, but that's the way it looks to me. Now, let's see what else we have here. What is meant by the Holy Spirit descending upon man? And if it is bestowed by the grace of God, how can one receive such a blessing? The problem in theology relating to the nature and substance of the Holy Spirit has been a controversy for 19 centuries, and I'm afraid we're not going to solve it tonight. But we'll do what we can in connection with trying to clarify it. The Holy Spirit is presumed to be that power of God, which is also referred to in the New Testament as the Comforter, or that which shall come to comfort man. The Holy Spirit is in the early Christian theology gradually incorporated into the structure of the Godhead as the third person of the Holy Trinity, composed of Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. The Father principle representing, as it does, the creating power of God. The Son, or the second principle, representing the continuing and preserving power of God. And the Holy Spirit resembling, in the theologies of other people, the changing or moving Spirit of God, by which nature and existence is in a process of continual transformation. The Holy Spirit, therefore, has been interpreted, at least by some mystics, to represent one of the most wonderful things in nature that we probably do not appreciate. In this concept, suffer things to be so now, this too shall pass away. And this, the Holy Spirit, is the continual presence of the ever-changing power, by which all things in their crystallization, in their gradual transformation into forms of bondage, are broken by a strange motion of time, that nothing is allowed to be locked forever in a prison of matter or of circumstances or conditions. The tyrant is not allowed to live forever. In order that he may not live forever, neither can the good man. This is a peculiar mystery in life. But life means change. Life is growth. Life is infinite unfolding opportunity. And all things have a tendency in the course of their existence to lose adjustability, to lose vitality, to lose the spontaneous power to change or to grow. Older folks are said sometimes to get sot in their ways. We look at the individual at 75 or 80 or 85 years old, and we become convinced that nothing much is going to change. If this person lived another 40 years, it would be about the same. Life is no longer constantly moving this individual into challenge, no longer giving him quick response to the vicissitudes of life. Gradually, life around him, in fact, is becoming terrifying. The changes, the speeding up of life and of the tempo of living, these things frighten these older people. And therefore, they are no longer able to adjust. In this circumstance, nature has provided a marvelous situation for the breaking up of all crystallization, so that life can never bog down. Life can never be locked in any negative situation, for life provides within itself the eternal release from itself, by means of which growth becomes assured, that man's attainment becomes assured, that the achievement of all that is truly good becomes assured, because no bypath, no dark, blind alley can ever hold anything. It can deviate for a time, but in the end of this time, it must come back, because the pattern of deviation is broken down. The invalid cannot remain in a sick body forever. Helen Keller cannot remain in a blind body forever. There must be release. This release is also true for other kinds of limitation. The mentally blind cannot defend themselves by their secure little patterns forever. The person who is wrong, the person who is militantly bad, the tyrant, the despot, the family despot, cannot go on forever. Everything has to change. Freedom comes to everything by this strange pattern, which to us sometimes seems very cruel, but is actually the final assurance that there can be no defeat of the purpose of life in creation. Things must fulfill themselves. In India, this third person of the triad is composed of the deity Shiva. This is the ancient mendicant, seated among the great snowy peaks of the Himavat, his body covered with ashes, and carrying in one hand the tridenta, the mysterious trident scepter of his great office. He is forever the sacrifice. He is in a strange way this deity who is always clothed in death, for death becomes the peculiar symbol of transition, of transformation, and of liberation. But I think that the general concept of the comforter in the religious world is this concept of motion, of life, that things can never be blocked, and that the great comfort and the great consolation lies in the fact that no one can defeat himself. No one can completely paint himself into a corner. No one can become so completely wrong that he can never hope to be right. Long before he can attain this, the whole pattern of his wrongness is broken up, and he starts again and starts fresh with a new blessing upon life and a new opportunity to build better faculties and powers. Therefore, perhaps, new opportunity, the rainbow that appeared after the deluge, the promise that there will always be a new opportunity for man to grow and to become the thing which he inwardly desires to be beyond all circumstances as we know them. I suspect that in the great symbolism of nations this was intended, but it is not always clearly indicated in a theology, but that all crystallization must break, and that life is forever digging a tomb for itself, and is ever rising victoriously from the grave which it has fashioned. Nothing can build a grave that will hold it forever. This is even true of the Egyptian who so carefully attempted to perpetuate his mortal remains. Can the living and the dead help one another? Does a link exist between the living and the dead that is important to both? I think that the question of this would lie very largely in the relationship of persons. There are those who are linked together strongly during life, and there are others who in the most intimate associations are not so linked. There are persons who have certain interior apperception of each other, even in this world, and there are others to whom all relationships are comparatively superficial. Thus, I would say that a link between two persons, either living or dead, would have to be a link of the most intense vibratory nature. This link is sometimes naturally found in identical twins, or it must arise from some intense sympathy, or from some great closeness, or perhaps in a few instances even from some great hatred, which will not permit these people to be released from their own feelings about each other. I do not believe that we can say that there is no possibility of the living influencing the dead or vice versa. As Cicero points out, these things have been recorded by our fathers, and there seems to be no doubt of their truth. I think, however, that the average person makes a mistake if he builds too much upon this concept, particularly if he permits a person who has passed on, or other persons of other times who have passed on, to form some kind of an executive council for the administration of his affairs. I think it is a mistake to permit the conduct of the living to be ruled by the dead. On the other hand, exceptional vision, some very great and powerful circumstance, some protection in emergency, some sense of nearness in catastrophe, these can be and have been most valuable in protecting and assisting the living. But for the most part, the exaggeration and sentimentalizing of this relationship has led to negative rather than positive results. I know persons who would hardly dare to move without consulting the Ouija board or waiting for a slate message. These persons have no way of knowing what kind of energy is moving the slate pencil or the Ouija board. They have no assurance, no fact. They are wrapped up in a mystery, and this mystery is psychologically rather dangerous and detrimental to them. I would therefore say that it is quite possible that in an emergency that such bridge could exist, but that the emergency, if it is real and proper, will provide its own bridge. And that as far as our relations to those who have gone on may be considered, our relation should perhaps be that it is conceivable, that they may know what we're doing, they may know what we're thinking, they may have some interest in our affairs. Therefore, certainly, we should only conduct ourselves in a manner that would bring them the greatest peace, comfort, and consolation. Therefore, our own improved conduct is probably the best thing we can do for them. If they know more than we do, they will want us to be better than we are. And if we assume that in death they have a deeper understanding of us, and that this casting off of the mortal coil has brought some sensitivity to them which we do not possess, certainly if they are loved ones, we shall want them to be happy. If we feel that these beings are near to us, we will want them to find comfort from this nearness, which must mean that we shall live well and as kindly and as nobly as we can, and not perform actions which would be likely to hurt or injure them. and that our attitude toward them should always be one of constructive and kindly thoughtfulness. That we should certainly not long to have them back, cry out for them to return, weep because they are not with us, or desperately try to get a message. These things are not what would cause happiness to us under the same circumstances, and certainly we have no reason to assume that the fact that we grieve for our lost loved ones is going to make them particularly happy. We would not like to look down from some distant place and find that none of our relatives have smiled since we left. This might be regarded as loyalty to a memory. But if death has brought us any larger understanding, we certainly do not want such loyalty. What we want to do is to prove the highest point of philosophy. As one of the Greek philosophers said, the highest tribute that an individual can pay to me is that he can live well without me. And this is the highest tribute our friends can hope. Therefore, if out of what we have learned, what we have gained from our loved ones, we have strength, courage, deep understanding, kindliness, wisdom, and true love, the love to release, the love to let these people know that we're grateful, we're wishing them well, but that we're not trying to drag them back into some sorrow which is our private burden. Therefore, if there is a connection, if this contact is possible, it would seem to me that the first thing we would want to do is to prove to those whom we care for, who have gone before, that we are happy, that we are adjusted, that we are living good, useful lives, and that we are preparing for our own transition in good time with as much wisdom and courage and love as is possible. That would be the type of thing I would think that someone who cared for us would want to know, and therefore what would bring to them the most peace in any other condition or state in which they may exist. When a person is sleeping and hears their name called so audibly that it startles one out of a sound sleep, does this arise from pressures of the subconscious? It can. It may be part of the same mechanism which causes us to wake up. It may be a violent statement of the ego identity. In other words, the individual has a nature. This nature has nothing to do with what he is named. The individual comes into the world without a name. It is given to him by his friends and relatives, and usually he wishes they hadn't chosen that one. Very few people are happy with their names. Sometimes they change them. Most of the time they simply endure them. But this being, the true self, is not a name. The name is a convenience given in this world in order to make certain identifications possible, to keep records and books straight, to be able to determine whether we are intermarrying with first cousins or not, or any one of interesting points, or whether we have at any time been a member of the Communist Party. These things are the real purpose of names, and sometimes these purposes are defeated by deceit and the changing of names. In all, when a person identifies himself, however, with his name, he is taking on a series of conditions which may have a considerable effect upon him psychologically. As a small child, he is taught to answer to his name, as little dogs are. When he gets older in school, he gets up when his name is called. When the roll is called, he says, "Here," answering to his name. Then later, if he becomes somewhat successful in life, he decides to try to make a big name for himself. He would like to perpetuate this name even after his own decease, like the man who burned the temple of Diana of the Ephesians long ago, because he said no man who ever committed such a terrible act as this could ever have his name forgotten by posterity. And it's been recorded faithfully ever since. It's now in this present edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica, for the one fact alone that this man burned the temple of Diana. So names become interesting problems and very psychological. But the subconscious identification of an individual with his name is simply the result of this long pressure of association. And this association means that the name belongs to what we see in a mirror. It belongs to this appearance of ourselves. It belongs to someone that was born at a certain date, lives for a certain number of years, lives at a certain address, has certain common responsibilities, works in a certain office, and in the course of time will depart from this world and be represented by a small memorial plaque on some wall. This is name. Now, why should the subconscious part of man take this on? Usually because he has gradually identified his true nature with this personality. He does not conceive of himself as being apart from his name. Therefore, he has taken this name and answers to it, not only physically but internally. And it is quite conceivable that there can be an over-identification. There can be too great an intensity of identity with name, or with formula, or with sound, to the loss of the sense of individuality or personality or the basic character of the individual. Now, a man does not generally call himself by name. He may under certain conditions. He may talk to himself. He usually does this because he enjoys listening to a smart man. And sometimes he may simply refer to himself by his name. But this is not generally the common practice. We are generally named by another person, or by some record, or some report in which our name appears. If, therefore, an inward voice calls us by name, it can represent a demand upon the personality, or the persona, from one of the archetypal parts of the personality, as we might expect in a dream or a vision. To name in this sense may therefore imply that that part of ourselves, which being more real, and therefore of its nature nameless, is addressing itself to that part of the nature which it recognizes as named, or which recognizes itself as named, thus addressing as a separate being some part of the personality. We can almost have the idea of this. The thought comes to our mind of Jesus standing before the tomb, calling out in a loud voice, "Lazarus, come forth." This idea of our name may be the archetypal part of ourselves attempting to enter into a relationship with the personality by identifying it by name. And it may also be a subconscious part of the process by which we awaken under certain conditions, in which we speak or talk to ourselves in an effort to achieve some particular purpose at that time. I would think, however, that if the phenomenon of repeatedly hearing our name called, apparently by someone else, continues for any length of time, that it should be regarded as some form of archetypal invitation for our own attention to become strongly fixed upon some internal fact, that perhaps an effort is being made to bring through to us by calling us to stop abruptly and accept the responsibility of listening when we are addressed by name. So I would assume at the moment that could be. Now here is a constant cause of religious uncertainty. What is meant by Immaculate Conception? Can the universal physical law be violated and be set aside to admit the entrance of a divine soul into this physical world, such as Jesus? I cannot affirm as to be factual the impossibility of an Immaculate Conception. I am not sure what the universe considers to be natural. I would say that from our standpoint it would be exceedingly unnatural. But whether this means that there is a dispensation for the entry of divinely appointed messengers, I would not want to say with dogmatic certainty. It is very possible, as ancient myths and legends have repeatedly pointed out, that it is possible for superior beings to overshadow mortals in some way and result in a conception as of a hero or of a demigod. I do not say that this is impossible. I do not know. I say, however, that in most instances it probably is a symbolic statement rather than a literal one, and that from a philosophical standpoint we have no proof of this idea of an actual physical immaculate conception. Actually, the word does not imply in superphysical or metaphysical in any way. The term immaculate simply means clean. It means pure. And in most instances, it is now generally assumed that it represents a dedicated union in the service of God, and therefore that the purpose of conception has been to bring a soul into life, an unselfish desire, a consecrated purpose of accepting the full and true responsibility of parenthood, and that this therefore would represent a pure or immaculate conception. To the degree of this metaphysical point, I would say that there are many records, many stories relating to the Immaculate Conception. Whether this also implies another point, which could well be, namely, that as in the case of the incarnation of Buddha, and it could likewise be applied to the incarnation of Jesus, the conception may have been normal, but under the direction, as Buddhism points out, of a divine hierarchy, and that when the conception occurs, that the superior entity enters in at the time of conception and takes over the body, thereby allowing the body to be molded by its own nature and stepping in after the actual process of fertilization has taken place. In other words, that Buddha is supposed to have done this, that finding that a very good and noble parents had sincerely and prayerfully desired that a child should be born to them that would be of service to his people and his world. That Buddha, beholding and knowing this inwardly while in the Tushita heaven, descended to this couple and took upon himself the body which they were creating. This is another possible explanation, perhaps at less variance with natural law. But it is noted that nearly all of the world's great teachers have been regarded as in some way immaculately conceived by some mysterious power, and that therefore the thought behind it is that apparently no ordinary human vehicle could be found sufficiently refined to meet the need of this incarnating divine being, which therefore was required to provide its own way. On the other hand, as in the Essene community at En-Gedi in Palestine, this dedicated community sought to so live and conduct itself that its members were available to produce pure bodies for the saints. This may also be a natural refinement by man. I do not think that a controversy over this is possible. We do not know that a superior being cannot accomplish this. We do not know that a superior being cannot enter in at the time of conception and take over a body which might otherwise not have been so dedicated and directed. These points we cannot with certainty dogmatize, but there certainly is the intimation in the subconscious of the race that the avatar or the incarnation of the divine being is associated by perfectly natural circumstances, natural to the level of that being, but perhaps not entirely natural to us, because we do not function upon that level, nor do we find the powers and attributes of that being available to us. I think, again, dogma is something we can't do much with. Here we go, down the line. Concerning spirit and soul, there has been much uncertainty and speculation. Please explain the difference. Well, we've tried to explain that difference on a number of different occasions, but perhaps we might summarize it briefly. We regard, more or less formally, the word spirit to signify the divine life at the root of things, and the human spirit as the essential being, or the total spiritual entity of man. That part which is derived most directly from the divine spirit, and therefore possessing within itself the fullness of life, the fullness of potency, which we associate with life, consciousness, God, and spirit. The soul, however, has never been so considered, although in our popular, more or less semi-materialism, we have now elevated the soul as a term to cover all parts of man that we cannot see. In other words, we have taken the soul and sort of pushed it upward until it becomes a term, a symbol, for the entire unexplained causal nature of man, including all his mental and emotional infirmities, his various psychic ailments, his characteristics, the constant battle between the anima-animus aspects of his nature, and the unconscious, the subconscious, the superconscious, and other terms which are rapidly disappearing from common usage because of meaninglessness. They can be very useful words, but they're not useful when we toss them around and do not give them any specific meaning. We're reminded of the line in Alice in Wonderland where we are assured that if we want to use words over time, we must pay them extra. And up to the present time, we haven't done this. The soul, to my concept, would represent a certain nature arising in man himself, what might be termed the gradual overtone of experience, creating what we term his psychic life. His psychic life being that so-called superior nature, which would correspond with what science feels would be the idea that man's invisible nature is merely the production of his visible processes, that the soul can be the result of experience, that it can be influenced by heredity, that it can be distorted by attitudes and policies, that it is subject to mental and emotional disease, pressure, and excess as the result of its own turbulences or imposed conditions. Poor childhood conditioning, poor educational conditioning, poor example, and the eternal, ever-present tragedy of falling on one's head in infancy. All of these things together could have an effect upon that part of our nature which is the product of our life here. Therefore, that the soul actually is a super self, a super personality, which is also gradually being refined into a spiritualized super personality that we might term, as the Chinese did it, namely the transcendent being. The transformation of our psychic life into the noblest that we know would be the regeneration of the soul, the transmutation of the soul, and the whole process of psychic transmutation would belong in the realm of medieval and ancient alchemy, as Carl Jung points out. It is the transformation process in man. The Bible says in one place, the soul that sinneth, it shall die. In another place it says, but the spirit returns to God who gave it. There seems to be an essential and basic difference, namely that the soul has within it an element of mortality. an element of change, that it is a dependency, that it is a suspension between spirit and matter. That soul, therefore, is a psychic polarization from form, and as form is the product of the union of spirit and matter, so soul is the product of the union of the invisible principles of spirit and matter, resulting in the establishment of character, disposition, personality, and temperament, themselves invisible but very real. The soul, then, is man's psychic overlife, whereas the spirit is an entirely divine thing. The early Christian mystics believed that soul would ultimately become a kind of body, and that man would gradually outgrow physical matter and live in a psychic instrument or body. And that in this case, this body would be his robe of glory. This would be the garments of the high priest, represented by the ceremonial vestments of the clergy. And that this is the golden wedding garment of St. Paul. And that man, attending the marriage of the Lamb, would wear the garments of glory, the garments of his own psychic life. But that the spirit was a divine thing, whereas the soul represented the redeemed or purified psychic life of the individual, or until this redemption, simply the normal psychic life of the individual. We hear much about self-improvement by evolution. Please correlate the importance of involution in this same process. Sounds like we might have an old student of Herbert Spencer around here somewhere. Actually, evolution and involution represent the aspects of one force or one law in operation. Evolution means to evolve, to grow from a center to a circumference, to ideate. And by evolution in the common scientific sense of the word, we understand the progress of species as this is set forth in the Darwinian theory. We recognize then that evolution is the evidence of a progressive unfoldment of forms according to species and kind, accompanied by a continuous and parallel unfoldment of intellect. That's pretty close to Spencer's definition. Actually, evolution seems to us the growing up of man, the unfoldment by degrees of the internal potencies of things, the transformation of potential into potency, the gathering and releasing of resource through achieved manifestation. Evolution is growth, not in the sense merely of the unfoldment of body, but in the sense of the improvement of type or kind. Evolution in the improvement of the mind is represented by schooling. For by schooling, the mind not only matures, but advances in its qualitative processes. And in the study of anthropology and ethnology, we become aware of the group, racial, or tribal developments of mental and social powers and faculties. Involution, according to antiquity or to the belief of most ancient peoples, is a process which must lead ultimately to evolution. Involution is the gradual involvement of life in the complex of matter. It arises largely from the Greek concept of thinking, by means of which a thing growing from the earth upward, in the Aristotelian sense, must have had a previous descent into the earth as a seed in the Platonic sense. That the a posteriori arises from the a priori, which in more common language means that the unfoldment of things must presume that first of all something was enfolded, something was first placed, and then began to release itself. The seed was the ancient symbol. The seed was sown in the ground, and after a certain time it grew out of the ground. The descent of the seed into the ground was the descent of the divine potential into creation. that life, first of all, became immersed in or descended into, or in the theological sense fell into, a state of material or mortal existence, so that the divine nature was obscured by matter, was obscured by substance and form, was obscured by ignorance, so that there is locked within every unit of life in the material world a divine power seeking to re-establish its authority over matter, to liberate itself by a process of metamorphosis, as in the case of the caterpillar turning into the butterfly. This was again a psychic symbol, and Psyche as the butterfly is commonly found in Greek art. Involution must precede evolution, for that which is to rise must first have descended into the state from which to arise is necessary. And involution implies the deity at first immersed itself in creation, and then gradually released or revealed itself through that creation into which it had originally been immersed. And in this revelation of itself, the involutionary process changed into an evolutionary process. And that which had gradually descended into a state of material isolation began then to ascend again into the freedom of its own true spiritual reunion with all other life in nature and existence, so that the growth of the plant and its bearing of the seed manifold is a symbol of the eternal release of God from nature. The descent of the infinite into a state of materiality represented the embodiment of creation. The revelation of this embodiment we have, and evolution is the gradual liberation of life from body through growth, and its reunion as one life in principle and in life, spirit, and in consciousness. Therefore, without involution, there could be no evolution. But involution was assumed by nearly all of the ancients, particularly by Plato, who assumed that all things began with God. And therefore, the deity by involution took upon itself the body of creation, and by evolution relives or releases itself, rising triumphantly from the grave of matter through the mystery of the universal resurrection. Therefore, the resurrection of God from nature is achieved by the process of evolution. Let's see what else we have here. Here's a nice little short one. Oh, well. What is the idea behind involution and evolution? That's so close to the other one that we might as well just go on a little further with it, maybe. Well, I think we have suggested that involution was used throughout antiquity to explain the condition of life being locked within matter. The rationale behind this is also quite important, because evolution reveals to us a continual release of life through matter. We have again, to refer to Spencer, Herbert Spencer, his great definition of deity, namely that God is infinite intelligence, infinitely diversified throughout infinite time and infinite space, and manifesting through an infinitude of ever-evolving individualities. Period. But this is your evolutionary process. Now, evolutionary process is continually revealing to us the potential which lies behind itself. A thing to evolve, to release or to reveal more than was previously apparent, must have this more as a potential in itself, or it cannot release it. Therefore, the evolution of species, like the growth of the tree from the acorn, must imply that archetypally the tree is in the acorn, that within the seed is the potential of all that must come out of it, Well, the universal potential, for it appears, for example, that even in the acorn we will never be able to measure the ultimate potential of the acorn. Because theoretically, sometime, somewhere, there must have been one acorn. And from that have come all acorns. And the last acorn that ever is fertile will be within the nature of the first one that was ever planted. So it gets to be rather complicated. Even acorns can take on impressive meanings. Thus, the infinite, which is within a thing, can only mean to even a reasonably thoughtful person one truth, namely that being itself, deity, reality, being, existence, essence, must be in the seed of everything. Otherwise, the infinite manifestation from that seed would not be possible. So the fact of evolution, which we can see, it must inevitably requires that the evolving thing have infinite potential which we do not see. This infinite potential to be present in a finite structure like the seed is in some way cramped or deprived of the universal with which we associate the infinite. Consequently, ancient peoples were of the feeling that at some time deity performed a voluntary sacrifice, or by some process became involved in its own creation, locked, so to say, within its own seed, and that having gradually descended from one level to another, until finally, even in the very physical earth, it was locked in the seminal life of all things, that this descent of life has to precede its ascent, for that which blossoms forth can only do so because of the God at the root of itself. So that evolution as a vast process of releasing theoretically implies involution as a vast process of gradual locking, which has to precede that which comes forth from itself. So that as inhaling and exhaling, or the ebbing and flowing of tides, or the polarization of yang and yin in the Chinese philosophy, that all processes have to equal. And if there is an infinite evolution or growing of things from themselves, then there has to be an infinite involution, or the gradual locking of things in themselves, which went on and still goes on in space, so that as one planet or one solar system evolves, another is gradually involving into a state of density or concentration or condensation, by means of which its energies are locked, and that ultimately these energies will be unlocked, and the process or polarity will be reversed, and another great system of evolutionary motion will take place. The idea behind it is that ancient peoples, and for that matter modern man, has no way of conceiving processes except by some remote relationship to the processes of generation. He does not know any of it. Therefore, he assumes the universe is the product of a vast process of generation, and that this process of generation implies the gradual building of a body, the locking of a soul in that body, and finally the release of that soul through that body through the development and growth of its individuality. This was the basis of their thinking. If time does not permit all the questions to be answered at this time, you extend the questions and answer series? Question mark. There's no will there, or can you, or anything. It's just sort of tossed together in a nice way. We can't extend them at this time, but we might one of these days, if the need seems to be very real. In the meantime, we better go on and get a few more of these under... If we are the direct results of our own consciousness, is not our consciousness made up of our instincts, feelings, desires, and thoughts? Or is it not because of our consciousness that we have instincts, feelings, desires, thoughts, and so forth? We all know that there are higher states of consciousness than our own. How can we hasten our involvement to embody these higher states? Is it a conscious training of consciousness by right thought, right action, and right speech, a loving and understanding heart put into action? Well, I would say the last statement's pretty good. It's in the right direction. Certainly it is a rather clear statement of the doctrines of the last Zoroaster, who declared that the good word and the good thought and the good deed are the foundations of virtue. And we certainly cannot in any way differentiate from that particular point of view. But let's see what we have here. We seem to have quite a complicated question. There is some condition or some problem as to whether or not consciousness is made up of instincts, feelings, desires, and thoughts. If we are thinking psychologically, that is true. If we are thinking in terms of modern philosophy, it is largely true. But there are schools in which we might have a difference of opinion on that point. There may be some schools that would regard consciousness as a pure evidence of the presence of the divine. I'm inclined to follow, however, the concept of Buddha, that consciousness is the byproduct of the testimonies of the various sensory perceptions. Therefore, that actually, let's say it this way, you see something. It is registered into yourself. Now, the thing that you see has a certain reality. Buddha did not teach the non-reality of matter. This thing, however, which is seen or heard or read by means of the sensory perception, once it is introduced into the nature of the person, is subjected to a series of modifications due to the conditioned reflexes of that person's inner life. And out of the testimonies of the perceptions, plus the coordinating of the mental coordinate, the individual arrives at what we might term ego consciousness, or self-awareness, which is his simply because he has discovered that there is a not-self around him. He knows he exists only because he has discovered that things other than himself also exist. And out of this discovery, he polarizes his own relationship to other things. He sees a chair, and he says, I am not that chair. I see that chair, it is there, but I am not that chair. Therefore, and for him now, an I exists as a result of his having seen many things that are not himself. He meets another person. I am not that person. Therefore, the need for an I that is separate from other things becomes increasingly urgent in our common experience. And around that I and our acceptance of it, we then build a series of interpretations which become the basis of thought, emotion, and action. Therefore, I would not say that consciousness in the sense of a divine consciousness is the cause of these emotions, but rather that consciousness is a coordinate of our faculties and the testimonies thereof imposes the concept of consciousness upon ourselves and then defines that consciousness in terms of our own understanding. This, however, might be a bit of apparently a fine point, which may not seem too relevant. But as you go further into the processes of philosophy, these things become more relevant. The practical problem here, apparently, is how can we hasten our evolvement to employ these higher states? We cannot truly hasten. All religion philosophy declares that the only way in which we can, shall we say, reach a moderate pace of achievement is through dedication and discipline. In other words, man as a being has a potential to grow at a certain rate. Most human beings are not keeping that potential due to the distractions of externals. The average person is not doing his best in the cultivation of himself. He has become unaware of the urgent need for this cultivation, for one thing, and his attention has been turned away from it. What we might say is, therefore, hastening growth would be perhaps nothing more than establishing the normal growth which is expected of us, but which has been long generally ignored or seriously neglected. The ancients had the answer as far as we are able to tell. Dedication, that is, the recognition of a need and the resolution of faculty to meet that need. Second is discipline, the willingness to impose control upon all faculties, energies, and powers likely to scatter resources or to cause us to deviate from the essential purposes of value or of truth or of essence. And, through the same situation, a broad and adequate program of self-improvement by which we recognize the contribution of learning or of knowledge to the attainment of that which essentially transcends knowledge. Thus, Plato would not permit anyone to enter the academy that did not have some foundation, an adequate foundation, in mathematics, astronomy, and music. He held that certain knowledge was necessary. Consequently, growth can be held to be dedication, moral integration, organization, self-discipline, resolution to improve, and certainly dedication to keeping all such principles as we hold to be essentially right, and to perform all such good, gracious, kindly, and unselfish action as may naturally and reasonably result in the help and improvement of others. Unfortunately, however, a certain amount of growth has to be attained before charity can be intelligently administered. Until we know more than we usually know, we are not able to truly help, because we have not an adequate understanding of the needs of other people. But at least, even if we make mistakes, it is far better to make mistakes in terms of sincere helpfulness than to remain selfish and indifferent to the common need. But I would say that the main problem is the enrichment, improvement, and maturing of ourselves, and the dedication of our lives and instincts to those activities which we regard as most valuable, meritorious, and necessary in the time in which we live. You speak often of the equity of nature and our need to learn its lessons. Would you please comment on the seeming brutality of nature, the law of tooth and claw, the savagery and cannibalism as seen in the struggle between species, and even man himself? This contradiction, if it be such, bothers me. Well, I've got news for you. You're not the first one. But under the problem of this subject comes one that we have to think of. We have to try to decide, first of all, in our own consciousness, what our principles are. Now, we can be wrong in principles, because principles have to be tested by application. If the principle cannot stand the test of rational judgment, then the principle has to be modified. We cannot be right and unable to answer the question. On the other hand, there are many forms of right which are so transcendent of man's capacity that he cannot answer the question rationally. Yet intuitively, he is compelled by his own nature to weigh the subject and cling to that which he knows to be good, even though he cannot explain it. Now, in nature and this problem of cruelty, we are not quite in this bad an extremity, but there are certain factors which we have to consider. First of all, is nature cruel? This is a very important question. We are not really in a position to answer it. We know that human nature can be cruel. We know that in our own kind, cruelty is not by any means uncommon or unique. But we also can ask ourselves a question. To what degree is human cruelty the result of the gradual accumulation of negative human policy? Are we cruel because nature so desired? Or are we cruel because we have gradually painted ourselves into a corner? Is the truly savage person cruel? It would seem that they are. And according to our standard, they would be. But in the course of time, I have discussed this problem not only with actually primitive people through interpreters, but also with missionaries who have gone into this country where there may be a few cannibals still remaining. And you try to explain to a cannibal that you think he is cruel. He simply does not know what you mean. He has never felt cruel. He has never experienced the idea of cruelty. He is under a social pattern which to him is just as justified as the fact that we feel it perfectly right and proper under extreme provocation to drop atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, which, after all, is probably a neater job than any group of cannibals ever achieved when it comes to something of this nature. And yet, who can say that we dropped those bombs because we wanted to be cruel? Cruelty becomes a matter of involved policy. It becomes a matter of trying to disentangle the confused skein of personal conscience and relate it or in some way bind it to a prevailing policy or to something else. I do not believe that nature's processes are essentially intended to be cruel. I think nature, however, in its own right, is forthright, which we are not. The things in nature which to us seem the most cruel would lose most of their cruelty in our thinking if, for example, we could have a larger perspective of what is taking place. We see a battle between insects. We see two elk locking their horns, and perhaps they will lock until they both die. We see processes like this, but we do not see value. I think most of our cruelty in estimating nature, as to whether nature is cruel or not, is to determine why nature does these things, what it achieves by doing them, and what its natural and definite processes are. The more we investigate into this, I think, the more we are inclined to suspect that cruelty is a moral attitude, and that cruelty is therefore a term that can only be used by a creature possessing a certain sense of moral value. Therefore, that man can be cruel, because man can be kind. But bugs and insects and termites cannot be cruel, because cruelty is a moral factor. And man, possessing the power to know that he can help, that know that he is capable of love, is then able to realize that when he profanes this and it becomes hate, he has committed a moral action. He would like to universalize his own delinquency. He would like to be able to say, see, I pull the wings off bugs, but bugs pull the wings off each other so that we're all equal. Well, if man wants to be a bug, that's one way of becoming equal. But it is a rather negative type of equality. It is man descending. Actually, man, having a certain understanding, is able to be kind, is able to be gentle, is able to be gracious, simply because in his experience these things have become valuable. Therefore, I would say that man, perverting for selfish purposes his own instincts, can be cruel and can injure other things. But nature, on the other hand, must protect those things which man injures. And nature also, in its highest aspects and in its greatest understanding, protects the people that men injure. It's not quite as open and shut a case as it appears to be. Most people who can be hurt are hurt because in turn they also can hurt. There is a certain level in which hurting goes back and forth. Nature is even very subtle in its handling of sickness, for example. One of the great mysteries of life is pain, where it seems that nature is particularly cruel. But again, man, in his desperate effort to outwit nature, has transformed it into a much crueler agent than it would normally and naturally be. Nature, as a good physician will tell you, nearly always anesthetizes a desperate sickness, unless man comes in and does something about it. If man comes in and interferes with those processes in nature, by which nature intends to terminate a situation as neatly as possible, and drags this situation out for perhaps years, then nature's processes fail. Not because nature is wrong, but because man hasn't the vision to understand the processes. And a great deal of tremendous suffering results from man's interfering with nature, of good intention, but without understanding what he is doing. On the other hand, nature is also gradually revealing to man ways to overcome this defect. And in time, man will solve the problem of pain as he is able to solve many other problems. But nature did not just set it up to make it miserable for man. Nature did not set up the miseries of childbirth. It has been the gradual changing of human society and its various artificial processes that have complicated this situation all out of natural proportion. And we are gradually overcoming this, realizing it's perhaps through hypnotherapy that man always had the power to control pain but didn't know it. In the same way throughout nature, if we think of nature as forever destroying, it's one thing. If we think of nature forever preserving balance, if we realize that these things that nature seemingly sweeps away are not gone at all, that all these so-called great tragedies that occur are tragedies within the dimension of our own understanding. To man, for instance, the most terrible tragedy in the world is premature death. And yet in nature we have no indication that this is cruelty. We have no proof that nature does not have a wiser purpose for this than we have ever thought of. And if nature removes forms, apparently, permitting as it always has life to live upon life, is this because of cruelty? Or is it because of the fact that nature has discovered in its own quiet way that all things grow only through adversity? Therefore, nature in its wisdom must create some kind of a continual pressure upon living things that they can never be secure until they become perfect. That the whole process of nature is to press life on to the perfection of itself. And if it must die a few million times to achieve this, it is not important. Because nature's purpose is to continually prove that nothing ever dies, and that these appearances and disappearances of things are only parts of a natural program, which is itself good. It is that man, in a combination of ignorance and sentimentality, cannot see far enough, and also because he is desperately anxious to broaden the foundations of his own mistakes and blame nature for temperamental peculiarities that are essentially his own. There is no doubt that man can be cruel, but this is due to the fact that man has an individual consciousness, an individualized nature, capable of decision, capable of what has been termed self-determinism. And because man has a faculty of self-judgment which is not known to exist in any other kingdom, man has a responsibility for self-conduct that is greater than that anywhere else in nature. And man trying to view the rest of nature in terms of his own experience can make a mistake, because he does not know how these other kingdoms actually operate. But he is inclined to assume, if he is thoughtful, that the wisdom that governs all things is not at fault in this. But unfortunately, up to now, the Muslim is the only one who has given any thought to animals in his theology. And unfortunately, he hasn't done it universally enough to solve anything. One of the reasons why we have had our troubles in trying to understand nature is because in our religion we have had no place in heaven for birds and flowers. And because of that, we have forgotten that they are also part of creation, and just as vital to creation as anything else. And also that the same deity that guards all other things guards them. And if we could understand these processes, we probably would understand the cruelty out of them. Just as it's sometimes hard to understand when our neighbor punishes a child, yet that child may have to be punished for its own good. So nature may administer certain punishment, but I do not think that nature is cruel or intentionally intends the injury of anything, and that all natural processes are based upon a great concept, that the final purpose is the great issue, and that this final purpose is accomplished by nature in as direct a manner as possible, and with as little harm as possible. But that nature in its infinite wisdom knows why it does this way. And I do not believe that it is an accident or that cruelty is anywhere in nature's intent. Because actually what nature does must be good, and that which is good cannot be cruel. It may have only the appearance of this. But where we get real evidences of cruelty, we've generally got a little human nature mixed up in it. Let's see now. That one's going to lead us off the deep end of something. Now, let's see. We have a little problem here. I have become very irritable toward the members of my family. How can I learn to control this? Well, it's very possible the members of your family have done irritable things to you. It's also very possible that your irritation has made your family harder to live with. This is quite a problem. It can work in a great many ways. But if you feel that you have a reasonably good family and that you're not getting along with that family as well as you should, and that little things or ordinary things create irritability, there are several points. If your nature has been consistently rather good up to recent time, irritability may be nothing more or less than a testimony of nerve tension. Maybe that you're overtired. Maybe that you're overtoxic. It's quite possible that you need a good physical checkup to see whether any physical ailment is creeping up on you that you haven't thought of or noticed. It is also possible that employment or situations are giving you too much pressure. It is also possible that insecurity has developed due to either debt or to lack of future or to the frustration of normal interests and ambitions. Maybe that you are not adequately supported by hobbies or avocational interests, that you are not maintaining an interesting enough contact with people. I would say that irritability is often a symbol of fatigue. It is also often a symbol of insecurity or a deep desire for a richer kind of life than you are having. This can be helped by rest, by proper nutrition, by increasing your own interests, by attempting to share in the interests of your family. There may be lack of bridge of contact because your lives are too greatly separated in interests, or it may be that you are incompatible in some respect, perhaps a little more philosophical thoughtfulness, a more sincere desire to see and appreciate the value in your family and what it can mean and contribute and the good things about it, which you have been maybe inclined to overlook a little, would also help in some way. You cannot sell yourself merely a psychological bill of goods, but you can frequently find value if you begin to look for that. Now, there are some persons also who at periods in their life seem to lock. They simply are not able to express themselves. They don't react as they're expected to. Other people expect them to be very warm. Perhaps they want to be warm, but they remain sort of chilly and aloof. There's a kind of a little wall built around their inner lives. These people simply cannot break through. If that is true, and you have this certain sense of isolation, that you're never going to quite be able to be just like everybody else, or get along with everybody as you want to, then you can build a new relationship. And that is a relationship of friendship, in which you work not from emotional intensities, but from a rather planned program of continuing cooperation. Other persons may not hardly be able to tell the difference. But a person who has difficulty in becoming emotionally involved in situations can very often become constructively concerned with situations and show a greater interest and a more valuable interest on the level of friendship than he would on the level of relationship. Now, it is perfectly possible for related persons also to be friends. It is perfectly possible for a person to be a friend of their husband or of their wife or of their children. Actually, without friendship, all other relations fail. With it, all other relations are strengthened. But if this emotional rapport, this sense of nearness, seems to be for some reason impossible to stimulate or maintain, then this good old-fashioned sense of being a good friend, a real pal, a sharing of things with enthusiasm, can often produce a very satisfactory substitute, one that the less sensitive person will not even recognize to be anything else than pure affection. But some people only can operate on this problem of the friendship level. Sometime I think it might be even interesting to make a general discussion of it, because there's a very subtle point there, which has occurred in the lives of many people. I'm not going to try that one because it's too long for the minute or two that we have left here. I want to get a quickie. I'll probably find one in 2 lines. It'll take a week to answer, but then we'll do our best. That one's also a little involved. Let's see. Why, after years of effort, are we not able to control our thoughts? I think perhaps we got muscle bound or something of that nature. You cannot really control your thoughts by trying. It's very hard to do. Theoretically, in yoga it can be done, but for the average person, the complete control of his mind by his mind is a rather ticklish trick, and not likely to be very well accomplished. Because we are asking the thing that is attempting to escape to control itself, and that is just what it doesn't want to do. So actually, instead of trying to control the mind in the sense of saying, this I will think, this I will not think, which is really pretty much a loss of energy and time, the mind must be fed with the things we want it to think. That is the important thing. Don't try to control the mind, but keep it constructively engaged. If you can give it good material to work with, you do not have to chastise it or stand over it with some kind of rod of punishment or control. The best way to control the mind is to sort of make a quiet decision of the things that you would like to do and the things you would like to be. Then forget the problem of control and simply start using the mind for these purposes without worrying as to whether you control it or not. Use it. Because there is nothing to be gained by tyranny over the mind. The real good is to be achieved by permitting the mind to become the instrument of your best purposes. To do this, you must feed it normally. You must give it good thoughts to think about. You must give it clear instruction. You must give it certain discipline in teaching it how to think. But like small children, you will find that usually the mind rejoices in these exercises, but it does not rejoice in being bossed any more than any other part of us likes it. But given a problem, the mind works with it, just as children, given a very dry equation or given a very unpleasant, negative type of teaching, may become rebellious or learn very little. But given their lesson in an interesting and dramatic form, love it, accept it, and learn it without knowing they have learned it. So to get better thinking, give your mind such material that it will become a better mind without knowing that it is becoming a better mind. Then it will never object, and you can lead it in the direction in which it should go. But when you say, I'm going to control it, you're merely opposing the mental process with will process. Perhaps you have no real reason for controlling it. Perhaps you are trying to force it to stop something you have taught it to do. This is not good. It's like telling a child not to do something it sees you do every day. It is better to give the mind this nutrition, give it a good positive material to work with, set it to an interesting task, and then let it go and work with it. And you'll find it'll take you along, and you will start solving things. The first thing you will make a friend out of your mind, rather than to regard it as a spiritual detriment to your divinity. You work with it. Make it a useful servant. Just don't let it boss. And it will boss unless you give it an interesting job. Then it will forget to boss you, and you will not need to boss it. In the solving of problems, it shows its ability and its values. And by this process, all good things are accomplished. Now, time is up, so I guess that's the best we can do. But we will keep these questions that are not answered, and in the course of time, we'll sneak in some way of finding out how to do it. We'll see that ultimately more of them are answered. But this is the best we can do tonight, I think, because you do have to get home.